Welcome to the channel. Today, we reveal how a journalist can be a wolf in sheep's clothing. Don't be fooled by all the makeup and Botox. This character has been around for over 65 years. Let's see what she has said about Kurds over the past 30 years. With every account, you can read one article for free on WashingtonPost.com. Let's dive directly into our analysis. Amberin Zaman's article, Öcalan conducted ruthless offensive, is not only a demonization of Abdullah Öcalan and the PKK, but also a clear reflection of Turkish state propaganda. Zaman chooses to portray Öcalan as a ruthless and charismatic leader, claiming that the PKK funds its operations through criminal activities, an assertion lacking credible sources, which reduces the Kurdish freedom struggle to mere terrorism. By uncritically echoing the Turkish state's accusations without questioning the systematic human rights abuses Kurds have faced for decades, Zaman reveals an alarming lack of journalistic integrity. Her article lacks both depth and balance, as she disregards the root causes of the conflict, namely, the Turkish state's violent repression and forced displacement of Kurds. In doing so, she presents an unreflective narrative that simplifies the PKK's role in the ongoing struggle. Let's analyze article number 2. And again, you can read one article for free for every account that you use. Turkish army chases rebels. Portrays the Kurds in a one-sided and negative light by using language and narrative that favors the perspective of the Turkish state. The article focuses on the violent behavior of Kurdish protesters and the Turkish military's successful offensive, casting the Kurds as lawless rebels rather than as an oppressed group with legitimate political demands. It is evident that Öcalan and the PKK are presented as responsible for widespread violence, without mentioning the underlying conflict over Kurdish rights and self-determination. Amberin Zaman's article serves as a veiled propaganda tool for the Turkish state by consistently demonizing the Kurds and downplaying their legitimate struggle for rights and self-determination. The article describes Kurds as violent rebels and terrorists, while the Turkish military's brutal actions against Kurdish areas are portrayed as necessary and justified. Zaman barely mentions the systematic persecution and oppression of the Kurds, and the article lacks a critical perspective on Turkey's own abuses. Instead of a balanced account, the text becomes a tribute to Turkey's moral victory, completely undermining the human rights of the Kurds. Let's listen to an interview with Amberin Zaman and Andrew Parasalidi.
So when the Turks attack, of course, civilian areas get affected by this, and this in turn, of course, creates tremendous anger among the civilian population, with many people displaced and even killed, and feeling resentful towards their own government, the KDP, KRG leadership, for failing to stop this. And so you have this sort of, situation where the more the Turks attack, the further the PKK moves into these KRG areas out of their, traditional mountain strongholds.
Knowingly, she lies about there being PKK guerrillas in these civilian areas. They're not even close to each other. It is an old policy on the part of the Turks to empty the area of Kurds, so-called soft ethnic cleansing. Then she tries to justify the Turks' attacks and that they are happening because the PKK is there, a repeat that has been repeated for decades. She goes on to say that the local people are angry with the PDK that rules the area for the attacks. But please, you still forgot to say that the locals hold the Turks more responsible because they're the ones killing them. Talk about bad journalism. Let's continue to listen.
Well, the problem is, you see, when the Americans sort of signed up for these unity talks between the SDF, or rather the PYD, there are all these acronyms that may confuse our listeners. So the PYD is the sort of main political party in Syria, northeast Syria, that has links to the PKK.
In this interview, so much is said, but with so little substance. For minutes, she talks in a monotone voice with a lot of insinuations. Lucky you didn't have to listen to all that. Here is a clip where Tucker Carlson expresses his irritation towards this type of journalists, who can never say anything concrete.
Don't like people like you in the media is that you never say exactly what you mean. Your slurs are all by implication, and you're about to tell me the great replacement theory is racist or anti-Semitic, whatever. Oh, God, come on.
Australian
How do they get people this stupid in the media? I guess it doesn't pay well. Look, I'm sorry. I've lived among people like you for too long, and I don't mean to call you stupid. Maybe you're just pretending to be, but...
Back to the analyze. Amberin Zaman tends to discredit the Kurds in her analyses by implicitly supporting Turkey's policies in northeastern Syria and by conveying a threatening perspective on Kurdish aspirations for autonomy. She portrays the Kurds' attempts to establish an autonomous region as a potential threat to Turkey and emphasizes their ties to the PKK, which reinforces a negative image of Kurdish groups and their allies. At the same time, she avoids questioning Turkey's extensive military actions, which have negatively impacted both Kurds and other minorities. By focusing on the Kurds' alleged connections to terrorism and Turkey's security interests, she appears biased, and her analysis lacks a critical examination of Turkey's role and responsibility in the region's humanitarian crisis. Let's watch another interview.
This president.
So is there anything that can
and
happen
he's
within this
managed
context?
to sort of galvanize public support for this campaign against the PKK. And it has to be said that the PKK, for its part, has, has its share of blame in all of this. If it says it was provoked, well, it need not have risen to the bait, because we had a 2-year ceasefire in place. People weren't dying anymore. And the fact that they moved their campaign to the towns has disrupted people's lives, just really shattered people's lives. And so it's going to take both sides to do some compromising, and we see no signs of it.
One final thought.
I must apologize for repeating myself, but it is because Amberin Zaman's journalism is repetitive like a parrot and monotonous, with an undertone that the Kurds could always do better and that it is actually their fault. Amberin Zaman diminishes the Kurdish struggle and legitimacy by adhering to rhetoric that largely echoes Turkey's state narrative, portraying Kurds as a destabilizing force rather than a people with rightful claims to rights and self-determination. Her description of the PKK and the Kurdish situation downplays the systematic abuses and discrimination Kurds have faced in Turkey. Instead, the focus is placed on Turkey's security needs, casting Kurds as a threat rather than a people fighting against oppression. Her biased portrayal effectively silences the Kurdish voice and trivializes their suffering in the conflict, ultimately serving Turkey's interests. Although experts with an objective view determine that it was the Turkish government that broke the ceasefire, as their plan to deceive the Kurds was not completed. According to Amberin Zaman, it is still the Kurds' fault that they defended themselves against the bloody attacks of the Turkish state after the ceasefire was broken. According to her, it is also the Kurdish resistance movement's fault that Kurds were murdered by the Turkish government. These so-called journalists make you sick. Let's continue to expose this so-called journalist.
Apparently, it's no way of dissuading Turkey, or at least there appears to be no meaningful attempt to do that. And one reason for it, of course, is that with everything that's going on in Gaza, Ukraine, Turkey, a critical NATO ally, has suddenly become much more important again. And so when the West is weighing its priorities, obviously Turkey comes first, not the Kurds. And the Kurds are feeling that very acutely. And they're kind of feeling betrayed as well. And they caution, they say, look, ISIS is resurging. The number of attacks just this past month alone in March, I believe there were 67, if I'm not mistaken, attacks in the northeast, but also many, many more in the government-controlled parts of Syria. This is going on. And because it's not Western lives, people don't seem to be paying attention. But ISIS has threatened to strike the Olympic Games. It's been talking about attacking the UEFA Cup final games. And they did this thing in Moscow. So ISIS is a threat. And as the commander-in-chief of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the US-led coalition's top ally in the fight against ISIS, told me, the conditions exist currently for a full ISIS resurgence. And, maybe the West will wake up when it's back again, striking them in the heart of Europe. But until such time, apparently, they're just looking the other way.
Amberin Zaman's journalism is as predictable as it is superficial. She doesn't even say that it was Turkey that supported ISIS and all the other Islamic groups that attacked the Kurds. There are thousands of proofs that Turkey helped ISIS. Turkey is even bombing prisons in Syria so ISIS terrorists can escape. For decades, the same narrative has been echoed. Turkey is bombing the Kurds. But where is the backbone of journalism that demands accountability? Simply repeating Turkey's acts of violence in her reports without demanding consequences isn't journalism. It's a way to avoid in-depth analysis. Will you never explain why Turkey has been killing Kurds for over a century? Will you never speak on why Kurds are killed and assaulted in Kurdistan? What is the problem in Kurdistan? Reporting on bombings without holding Turkey accountable for its ongoing provocations against the Kurds is cowardly and incomplete. Where is your humanitarian responsibility, which runs far deeper than mere journalistic duty? Amberin Zaman always resurfaces with the same old line. Turkey is threatening and bombing the Kurds. It's as if she's discussing architecture. In her interviews, it's clear she isn't Kurdish and lacks empathy for Kurdistan's victims. Yet, Amberin Zaman must gather the courage to ask the hard questions. If Amberin Zaman is going to continue reporting on Turkey's attacks, perhaps she should start pressing Turkey instead of delivering the same empty, monotonous comments. What do Turks expect from the Kurds? After all, you grew up and lived in Turkey. You know there was a time when just uttering the words Kurd or Kurdistan could be punishable. Some people were literally killed for using those words. Yes, these things happened. What do you want the Kurds to do? We need more than Amberin Zaman's repetition of Turkey's aggression. Hold the power to account, or pass the role to someone brave enough to do so. Let's quickly listen to the last video where she recently made these stupid statements that the Kurds again should propose a unilateral ceasefire.
And one potential, I think, good faith gesture would be for the PKK to perhaps call a unilateral ceasefire at this stage. What do you think, Garan?
So I think we are beyond unilateral steps at this point. In all honesty, the PKK, I think, if I'm not mistaken, up until now have declared 9 unilateral ceasefires. If that was the most significant step, it would have worked by now, and it simply hasn't. And I think, especially the last peace process, really did show us that unilateral steps or good faith steps at very preliminary stages of such a process are not as impactful as people might think. We are in a time now where the Turkish state is constantly bombing the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And we don't see that in our media as much. But when something happens in Ankara, it's way more, it's on the media, it's on the agenda, and people think that the conflict just erupted out of nowhere and we have a new round of violence. But the conflict and the war has been ongoing for years without break. And the Turkish intelligence and the Turkish military are very proud of the fact that they can strike the PKK both, in both the cities and the mountains of the Kurdistan region, and they have been doing so for the last 6 or 7 years, and are very proud of the fact that their drones can reach that far. But that's not trumpeted, or that's not on the media as much, and so we're kind of dislocated from that part of the conflict. And so when an action or an attack like we saw in Ankara erupts, we feel like that just happened out of nowhere. But there is a wider conflict going on, and that is part of the conflict. And that's part of the conflict that we actually are trying to solve right now.
I think Amberin Zaman is not as intelligent as she pretends to be. She seems almost stupid. Her suggestion that the PKK unilaterally declare a ceasefire is deeply irresponsible and shows a flagrant lack of understanding of the conflict. The skilled journalist Jiran Oskin, who is in the program, answers that the PKK laid down its weapons unilaterally 9 times. The Turkish government, with the support of the Turkish people, is daily bombing Kurdish schools, hospitals, and civilian facilities in all 4 parts of Kurdistan. To even suggest that the PKK should lay down its arms without any guarantees from Turkey is a direct insult to the Kurdish struggle. Turkey has taken advantage of previous ceasefires to strengthen its military position and persecute Kurds even harder. Zaman's demand is not only naive but also dangerous. It exposes an appalling indifference to the Kurdish population's right to self-defense and security. Why doesn't she think that Turkey should declare a unilateral truce when they are the ones who seem to be starting a new plan to deceive the Kurds again? Recently, the influencer Ali Shevin was arrested after he publicly stated on social media that he is Kurdish and not Turkish. In connection with his arrest, he was tortured for just being a Kurd. Nevertheless, Amberin Zaman talks about how the Kurds should unilaterally declare a ceasefire. Smart equation miss. And Erdogan has recently said that there will be no peace talks with the PKK's headquarters in Kandil. Amberin seems to be wrong in every aspect. In conclusion, we would like to say that after we confronted Amberin Zaman's terrible journalism about the Kurds, she has tried to nuance her analyses and does not direct as much unfair conclusions in the conflict in Greater Kurdistan. Could Amberin Zaman be a journalist who is a wolf in sheep's clothing, not particularly intelligent, or perhaps a bit of both? What do you think? If you have any suggestions for other people or interviews that we should review, please write it in the comment field or send us an email directly. It's important that you support, follow, and share our videos. It's completely free. While Amberin Zaman consistently avoids highlighting the systematic attacks on Kurds, we can no longer stay silent. We are under constant attack from Turkish government and Turkish civilians. And by spreading our voices, we can together bring to light the truth that otherwise risks remaining hidden.